It started with a smile that wasn't real, the kind of grin that hides arrogance behind false authority. In a quiet neighborhood lined with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, one man ruled with an iron fist disguised as community service. The HOA president, a man who believed power was his birthright. Rules were his language, and control was his obsession. But for Michael, the new homeowner at the end of Cedar Lane, it wasn't just about lawns and mailboxes. It was about fairness, about respect, and about refusing to be bullied by someone who thought a title made him untouchable. He didn't move to this neighborhood for drama. He moved for peace, for a fresh start after a long year of rebuilding his life. He'd worked hard to buy his home. Every inch of it felt earned. The paint still fresh, the porch light glowing warmly at dusk. He thought this neighborhood would be his quiet haven, but peace doesn't last long when pride and power meet across the property line. It began small, a letter in the mailbox, violation notice stamped in bold red ink. His grass too long by HOA standards. A minor issue, easily fixed, but something about the tone felt off, a warning that didn't sound neighborly, but threatening. And from that day, Michael learned, this wasn't just a community. It was a kingdom ruled by one man's ego. Over the weeks, the letters continued. The fines piled, and the tone grew colder. The HOA president, Richard Palmer, seemed to have made Michael his personal project. Every small infraction became an opportunity to remind him who was in charge. But what Richard didn't know was that Michael was no stranger to battles of control. He'd spent years in corporate management, navigating egos bigger than budgets. And this time, he wasn't going to fold. The tension brewed quietly at first. Neighbors whispered about it, some sympathetic, others afraid to take sides. They'd all seen what happened when someone defied Richard. Selective enforcement, endless fines, and public shaming at HOA meetings. He ruled not by fairness, but by fear. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the cul-de-sac, Michael stood by his fence, watching Richard inspect his lawn with that smug smirk. Clipboard in hand, eyes scanning like a warden. And something shifted inside Michael that evening. That quiet resolve that turns victims into challengers. He wasn't going to let another man's insecurity dictate his peace. Because every tyrant forgets, power isn't permanent. And sometimes, the people they try to control are the ones destined to rise higher. This is the story of how an ordinary homeowner took on his HOA's most arrogant leader. How the rules he once feared became the tools of his revenge. And how, in a twist no one saw coming, the man who tried to bully him would one day be forced to call him boss. The letters didn't stop. They came weekly now, each one colder than the last. Each one stamped with that same red block of authority. Sometimes they were about a trash can left out too long. Other times about a garden hose coiled the wrong way. The absurdity almost made Michael laugh. Almost, because he knew this wasn't about the rules anymore. It was personal. Richard, the HOA president, seemed to take joy in the chase. He would stroll through the neighborhood with his clipboard like a sheriff on patrol. Neighbors would lower their gaze as he passed, unwilling to draw attention. They had learned that resistance only made things worse. Fines could double, privileges could vanish, and meetings could turn into public humiliation sessions. Michael kept the notices neatly stacked in a file on his desk. Every page was dated, every rule cited. He wasn't collecting them out of fear. He was building a record, quietly, methodically, because if there was one thing he had learned in the corporate world, it was that paper trails topple empires. Weeks turned to months. By summer, Richard had expanded his campaign. He began citing Michael for landscaping inconsistencies, claiming his shrubs were 2 inches higher than regulation. He even mailed photos as evidence, snapshots taken at odd angles to exaggerate minor issues. Michael saw through the tactic. Intimidation disguised as diligence. Neighbors started whispering again. Some told him to just comply, to keep the peace. But peace built on submission wasn't peace at all. It was quiet surrender, and Michael refused to kneel. One evening, after another violation arrived, Michael sat at his kitchen table, the warm glow of the pendant lights spilling across the letters. He took a slow breath, opened his laptop, and began to dig. He pulled up the HOA bylaws, all 72 pages of them, paragraph after paragraph of dense language that most residents never bother to read. But to Michael, it read like opportunity. He discovered loopholes, contradictions, outdated clauses that Richard had been exploiting for years, sections that allowed selective enforcement. A legal gray area if ever there was one, and buried deep in the administrative section, Michael found something else, a clause about election procedures, transparency requirements, and term limits. Limits Richard had long exceeded. That night, the plan began forming. Not revenge, strategy. If Richard wanted to play by the rules, Michael would master them. He would use the same system that bullied him to dismantle the throne it protected. The following week, Michael attended his first HOA meeting. The room was small, fluorescent lit, filled with folding chairs and uneasy neighbors. Richard sat at the head of the table, posture straight, voice booming with authority. When Michael raised his hand to speak, Richard barely looked up. But Michael spoke anyway, calm, precise, armed with facts. He questioned a recent fine structure, citing inconsistencies in how it was applied. Murmurs rippled through the room. For the first time, neighbors were hearing the rules turned back on their enforcer. Richard's face tightened. That smug confidence faltered for a moment. After the meeting, a few residents approached Michael quietly. They thanked him, said they'd been afraid to speak. Some even confessed their own unfair fines. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, the first cracks in Richard's wall. At home later, Michael opened his file again, added fresh notes, emails, timestamps, witness names. The record was growing thicker, heavier, like the weight of something inevitable. By autumn, the conflict had become open. Richard began sending notices for fabricated violations, a non-existent leak in the fence, a supposed noise complaint, petty acts of control. But each time, Michael responded with calm professionalism, forwarding copies to the board and requesting official review. Every move Richard made now left a trail, and Michael was following it. And then came the mistake. One email, sent to the wrong address. Richard meant to send it privately to a fellow board member, mocking Michael, calling him a problem homeowner who needed to be put in his place. But he sent it to the entire HOA mailing list instead. The fallout was instant. Neighbors who had stayed silent began to question everything. The image of authority Richard had cultivated for years cracked wide open, and Michael, methodical, patient, always collecting, now had what he needed. The power dynamic was shifting, slowly, quietly. The bully was losing his audience. What neither of them knew yet was that this was only the first phase. Because Michael wasn't finished, he had already discovered a way not just to stop Richard, but to replace him. Autumn bled into winter. The trees along Cedar Lane stood bare, their branches reaching like dark fingers into gray skies. The neighborhood felt different now, quieter, more watchful. Every time Richard's truck crawled down the street, curtains twitched. The fear he'd used to hold people in line had become fatigue. People were tired of walking on eggshells in their own driveways. Michael felt it too. The tension had shifted. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was leading something unspoken. At night, emails from neighbors arrived, stories of unfair treatment, overcharged dues, fines for nonsense infractions. A picture was forming of a man who'd confused leadership with control. He started inviting those neighbors for coffee, small gatherings at his kitchen table, the file of violations laid open like evidence in a courtroom. He listened, took notes, compared documents. Every story echoed the same pattern. Intimidation, silence, compliance. By the third meeting, there were 7 of them. By the 5th, 12. They decided to act quietly. Not protest, not rage. Just use the system exactly as it was written. The bylaws allowed members to request a special audit and to nominate new leadership if there was evidence of misconduct. Most people never bothered. Richard counted on that. But Michael had already marked the pages, highlighted the clauses, memorized the timelines. Through winter, he built the case. Spreadsheets of dues collected, expenditures without receipts, minutes missing from meetings that never seemed to be recorded. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was negligence, maybe worse. He didn't accuse. Not yet. He simply documented, because paper doesn't shout. It waits. Then spring came. The air smelled like wet soil and beginnings. The HOA's annual election was 2 months away. Michael filed the paperwork to run for a board seat. He didn't announce it. The notice would appear, as required, on the next community bulletin. When Richard saw it, the reaction was immediate. A letter arrived the next day. A new fine, claiming Michael's garden lights were unauthorized fixtures. Michael didn't respond with anger. He printed the letter, added it to the file, and kept moving. His meetings grew larger now. Neighbors volunteered to distribute copies of the bylaws, highlighting the election procedures. Someone offered to host a barbecue to talk about community improvements, but everyone knew what it really was, a gathering of the unheard. The night of the barbecue, laughter returned to Cedar Lane. Children played in the street again. For a few hours, fear took a back seat to fellowship. And somewhere in the hum of conversation, a quiet consensus formed. They wanted change. When the election meeting finally arrived, the small room was packed beyond capacity. Folding chairs lined the walls. People standing in the back. Murmuring, Richard opened with his usual practice confidence, listing achievements, dismissing complaints, controlling the pace. But then came the nominations. Michael's name echoed through the room like a crack of thunder. He rose slowly, calm, deliberate, and thanked the community for their trust. He didn't speak long. Just enough. He reminded them that rules were meant to protect, not punish. That leadership was service, not authority. And when he finished, even those who'd stayed neutral were nodding. The ballots were collected. Minutes stretched into something heavier than silence. When the results were read, the numbers weren't close. Michael was elected vice president of the HOA. Richard still held the presidency, but the ground under him had shifted. For the first time in years, he didn't command the room. That night, walking home under the glow of porch lights, Michael felt something he hadn't in months. Peace. Not victory. Not yet, but balance returning. He knew Richard wouldn't give up control easily. Bullies never do. But now, Michael had a seat at the table, access to the records, and the authority to open every locked cabinet. Behind the smiles and handshakes, a new game had begun. And this time, the rules belonged to him. The first weeks after the election felt almost calm. Richard kept his smile tight and his words measured, pretending that nothing had changed. Yet beneath that veneer of composure, cracks had begun to form. Michael could see it in every meeting. The way Richard's hand tightened on his pen whenever votes didn't go his way. The way neighbors no longer looked to him for permission before speaking. Michael used that quiet to work. Nights spent at his kitchen table, stacks of folders lit by the soft amber glow of a desk lamp. Financial records, maintenance contracts, invoices, each one a thread waiting to be pulled. He noticed numbers that didn't align, signatures missing from approvals, payments made to companies that didn't seem to exist. He didn't accuse, he verified. One by one, he tracked those companies. A landscaping service registered under a relative's name. A consulting firm paid thousands for non-existent audits. Every discovery was copied, time-stamped, filed. He moved carefully, methodically, because he understood what was at stake. If he acted too soon, Richard would bury everything. At the next board meeting, the tension was palpable. Neighbors filled the seats again, their eyes sharper this time. Michael waited until the agenda reached financial report. Then, in the same calm tone he'd used all winter, he asked about the missing receipts for last summer's fence project. Richard's reply came clipped, defensive, words tumbling too fast. The room went still. Michael placed a printed statement on the table. An invoice from the same project, but with a different amount. One that had been altered in the records. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. For the first time, Richard had no script. His mouth opened, then closed, his usual confidence gone. The following days unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. Neighbors whispered in driveways, comparing notes. Someone discovered that their own fine payments had never been logged. Another found duplicate charges for landscaping that was never done. The story spread through the community like wildfire. Michael didn't gloat. He stayed steady, documenting everything. By the time the city's property oversight office received the anonymous packet, thick with photocopies and timelines, Richard's control was already disintegrating. Weeks later, an official letter arrived for the HOA. An audit had been ordered. The board convened in emergency session, faces pale under fluorescent lights. Richard tried to shift blame, claiming clerical mistakes, but the numbers told their own story. Money had flowed where it shouldn't. The audit report landed like a thunderclap. Funds misused, procedures violated, multiple breaches of fiduciary duty. Richard was removed, pending further review. His resignation followed within days. When a notice was read aloud at the next community meeting, no one cheered. They simply exhaled. The long breath of people who had held tension for too many years, the fear that had haunted their neighborhood, evaporated in that single moment. Michael didn't expect gratitude. He only wanted restoration. He proposed transparent accounting, open-door meetings, community votes on future projects. For the first time, people volunteered. Laughter returned to gatherings. The fences that once divided neighbors now framed gardens shared between them. But behind the victory, there lingered something deeper. A reminder. Power, when left unchecked, corrodes slowly, quietly. And sometimes it takes just one person, armed with patience and proof, to turn the tide. As spring warmed the streets again, Michael walked past the old community notice board. A new flyer fluttered there. A thank you from residents, signed by dozens of names. Beneath it, a small note from the city acknowledging his help in uncovering the misuse. He smiled faintly. Not triumph, just closure. The man who had once been targeted now sat in the chair of fairness. And somewhere beyond those quiet suburban lawns, a lesson took root. That integrity, though silent, always finds a way to be heard. The months that followed felt almost unreal. Where there had once been fear and silence, there was now a slow but certain hum of rebuilding. The HOA that had once felt like a private kingdom now belonged, truly, to the people who lived under its rules. Michael sat at the head of the same table where Richard had once ruled. The difference was unmistakable. Gone were the closed doors and raised voices. In their place came open notebooks, quiet discussion, neighbors sipping coffee and talking like equals. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, patient, human. He restructured the association from the ground up. Every receipt scanned, every decision documented, every fine reviewed for fairness. Committees formed. One for maintenance, one for landscaping, one for events, so that no single voice could ever dominate again. At first, the change felt fragile. Old habits die slowly. Some neighbors still flinched when official letters arrived. Some looked nervous when HOA meetings were called. But Michael understood. Trust wasn't something you declared. It was something you proved. Week by week, project by project, he proved it. Instead of threatening fines, the board offered help. Instead of restricting creativity, they encouraged it. A small community garden appeared at the end of Willow Court, planted by 3 families who'd once barely spoken. A bench followed, then a mural painted by local teens. Little things, but they mattered. Michael never forgot the nights when he'd sat alone, reading bylaws and questioning his sanity. Those memories fueled him. Not as anger, but as purpose. He used the same determination that had once been labeled defiance to rebuild what Richard had broken. Then came a letter, this time from the city, official stationery, embossed with a seal. It wasn't another complaint, or a warning, or an audit. It was recognition. The community had been nominated for a local civic renewal award, celebrating transparency and neighborhood engagement. The night of the ceremony, the auditorium lights shimmered softly over rows of smiling faces. Michael didn't expect to be called to the stage, but when he was, the applause that followed carried more than gratitude. It carried relief, unity, and quiet respect. He looked out at them, families, retirees, newcomers, people who had weathered the same quiet storm. In that moment, he realized something simple yet profound. Victory had never been about titles or power or even revenge. It was about restoring balance, about proving that decency, when backed by patience and persistence, can outlast corruption. Afterward, back in the neighborhood, the world looked different. Maybe it was the same trimmed lawns, the same mailboxes, the same quiet evenings. But the air felt lighter. Laughter echoed from driveways. Children played on sidewalks where once there had been tension. And Michael, Walking home beneath the warm glow of porch lights felt something rare. Peace. Occasionally, he'd pass Richard's old house. It stood quiet, sold to a new family who planted flowers where Richard's approved hedges used to be. The world moves on, Michael thought, and sometimes the best justice is simply progress. He paused at the community board once more. Pinned beneath the glass was a new flyer, a call for spring volunteers, signed at the bottom. Board chair, Michael Turner. Below it, someone had added a handwritten note in marker. Thanks for giving us our neighborhood back. He smiled, not out of pride, but contentment. The storm was over, and the story, his story, had found its resolution. In the end, it wasn't about taking power. It was about taking responsibility, because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't retribution. It's redemption, the kind that rebuilds not only a neighborhood, but faith in what it means to stand up quietly and firmly for what's right. And as the camera of life panned out, over tidy fences, blooming gardens, and glowing porch lights, one truth remained. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through good men who simply refuse to be silent.